Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I know we are track 9 of 10 sessions at this point. So what you really need right now is to hear someone talk about vulnerabilities to help you drive yourself home. Finish this out strong. But in all seriousness, today we're going to be talking about 0 days, what we're seeing in terms of their usage, some high-level trends that we're seeing, and ultimately what you as organizations can do to protect yourself. Real quick, let's introduce the team. My name is Jared Semrau. I am the senior manager of our vulnerability and exploitation team with FireEye Threat Intelligence. Originally, my background was in financially motivated activity, where I was focused more on money laundering and monetization schemes. But about 8.5 years ago, I was asked to take on a role with our vulnerability intelligence group, trying to bring some threat perspective to a team that was otherwise previously just kind of technical focused. And with that, I'll let Kat introduce herself. Parnian.
Hi, I'm Parnian Najafi, senior analyst working at Advanced Analysis. And my background was in vulnerability and IoT penetration testing. Right now, my role is more focused on looking at the cyber threat actors and the methodology and techniques that they use. And Kat, here you go.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kat Metrick. My background is in deep and dark web research, but now I'm an analyst with our strategic intelligence team, focusing on the broad trends that we see in cyber physical, cyber espionage, cyber criminal activity.
All right. Thank you, guys. So, as we get set for our talk today, there are some key questions that we put forth to ourselves when starting to make this presentation and an accompanying report that we have. That'll help kind of orient you around how to think about the content that we're providing you today. Some of these we're actually going to address head on. Other ones you'll just kind of be getting the answers for as we have the talk. But those questions are, what is a 0 day? Are 0 days a concern to me? Who is using them and why? How has 0 day usage changed over time? And ultimately, what can I do to protect my company from 0 days? So let's take the first question on that list first. What is a 0 day? It may seem silly to a crowd like this to try to explain what a 0 day is, because I think most people here have an idea what a 0 day is. But it's odd as a vulnerability expert when I go online and I look up definitions for what a 0 day is. There's so many minor distinctions as to what people consider 0 days that I think it's helpful for us to have a common working definition today, just so everyone understands what I'm talking about. So for our purposes, a 0 day vulnerability is a known flaw in software or hardware that leaves systems exposed to cyber attacks before a patch is available to properly mitigate the attack. We're also going to be making a distinction between the 0 day vulnerabilities themselves and 0 days that are being exploited in the wild for malicious activity. And so for the purposes of today, we are going to be focusing on those that have been exploited specifically by tracked threat groups. To give you a quick idea of some of the data that we use for this talk today, the vast majority of the stuff we're talking about today is proprietary, FireEye original research. That's coming from our managed investigations, our managed defense teams, and other internal teams that are doing great technical analysis, as well as our threat intelligence's underground research. But another great source that I'd like to call out, just because I've found this to be fascinating since it came out relatively recently, Google Project Zero's 0 day in the wild spreadsheet. It's been a good resource to kind of compare and contrast the data that we already had to see where we stack up, and luckily for us, it was pretty good. And additionally, there's always other additional open source collections that we're using to help bolster the knowledge throughout this presentation. Overall, we feel really confident about the data we have, but the reality is with a project like this, we're constantly reevaluating the data that we have and updating it based on. So this is a living document in terms of how we see this. So last thing before I go into my first main section is just a couple quick case studies to help kind of orient us around, some real world 0 day scenarios and potential impacts that they have and how they can vary between attacks. The first one that we want to talk about is the Sandworm team today. I think Sandworm team is something most people are familiar with. Early activity was back in 2013, but we're looking at the 0 day usage, which was back in 2014. And while Sandworm team as a whole had been targeting various entities all throughout Europe and at least one American individual, in terms of the 0 day usage, they had a single 0 day. It was CVE 2014-4114, And that 0-day was only used to target a small number of regional Ukrainian government targets. And as far as we ever knew, a single American academic who was doing research into Russia that was critical of the regime. So this was very highly targeted, a small number of targets, but it was worthy to them to use a 0-day to perform this activity. Let's look at another example, one that's been talked about by at least a couple presentations this week, Stuxnet. This is one that probably doesn't really need that much discussion going on because most people in this room are familiar with. But the reality is this was a pretty unique case in the sense that here we had a group that was willing to burn 5 0-days to gain access to a network, to maintain persistence, and to spread. Up until that point, and even since, you still hear people, kind of smirk when they hear, why would they burn 2 0-days to do this? But the people behind Stuxnet thought it was important enough for what they were trying to accomplish to use 5. And we know that the outcome of that was to degrade the quality of the Iranian centrifuges to cause physical destruction. So these are 2 separate examples that show just how people leverage them and the potential outcome that they have from this type of activity. Now, we are going to spend a lot of time today talking about tracked group usage in the current state, but as a vulnerability nerd myself, I did want to spend a little bit of time on the kind of history of 0-days and how we got to today, because I think it's an important discussion to understand where we're at now. So this is just a 4-year graph, but what it's showing you is up until this year, 2019, year over year, we saw a steady decline in the total number of 0-days that were being leveraged by malicious actors in the wild. This graph is actually outdated as of this morning because we've officially hit our 20th 0-day this year. And so we have met 2016's total, and we have the rest of the quarter to potentially surpass this. But we're on pace to have about 28 different 0-days this year, which is a significant spike from what we've observed year over year. Now, this initially sounds bad, I know. No one wants to hear that we have a rise in 0-day activity. But the reality is the type of activity that we're seeing is changing. So whereas in years past we saw a ton of widespread activity where actors were performing to hit a lot of people, this year we've only seen 2. And up until this morning I would have said 1, which was the Oracle WebLogic server vulnerability. But the one today that reportedly affects iTunes is also being used to spread Bitcoin miner payloads. So what does this mean? Is this an indication of a shift in 0-day discovery rate? That's something I'll leave the cat to kind of dive into a little bit more. But it's definitely an interesting trend to note. So before we talk about that, let's talk about why the decline was happening in the first place. What got us to the point where we were seeing that year-over-year decline? And the first reason is, quite frankly, there was a decline in exploit kit usage of 0-days. And to me, that's actually relatively easy to explain. Back in 2013 and 2016, successful law enforcement activity saw the arrest of the developers behind the Black Hole exploit kit and the Angler exploit kits, respectively, being taken out of the marketplace. So up to that point, this was a ripe market. We saw a lot of 0-days coming through for the first time through exploit kits. And quite frankly, after both those arrests, you saw a notable dip in the 0-days in the marketplace. In fact, after the developer of the Angler exploit kit was arrested, we haven't seen a 0-day in the market being used for exploit kit activity since 2017. So that's 0 last year, 0 this year. And while you think that's only 2 developers that were removed from the market, that had pretty significant ramifications because up to that point, they were acting pretty brazen where, I mean, if people remember the forum post of Ponch for Black Hole exploit kit, they were openly advertising exactly everything their kit did and what they were doing when they were doing it. But following that, we saw some of the other prominent developers just flat out quit the marketplace, just go off, they said, we're done, I've made my money, I don't need the risk at this point. We saw others go into more established, more exclusive relationships with private groups or teams, and they were less out on the marketplace openly. Other factors that actually led to the decline of 0-days is the decreased viability of browser-based attacks. So when I first got into the vulnerability space, basically 90% of my headaches was Java vulnerabilities. But back in 2013, Oracle made the simple step of increasing their default security settings for Java. And what that did was simply just create an additional pop-up anytime you tried to run a self-signed or unsigned Java applet. It seems like a minor thing, but this caused enough of a disruption to their activity that they didn't see it was worth their time and effort to go after Java anymore. In fact, since 2013, we've only seen one Java vulnerability be exploited at all. And that's because that one vulnerability bypassed that security prompt that was added. Other good reasons as to why browser-based attacks have started to dip is the introduction of automatic browser updates. This has limited the time that these browsers were being left exposed vulnerable to attacks through exploitation of 0 days and vulnerabilities. And also the looming Flash end of life. And not just the end of life, obviously a lot of developers have moved away from using Flash as a tool anyway. So there's less of a reason for you to have it on your computer in the first place. And finally, the last reason that really explains this kind of year-over-year decline that we saw up to this year is there was a significant shift in actor tactics that we saw. Back when I was doing financially motivated activity, I can think of the days of Zeus, where the whole goal of their motivation was to get as many people infected as possible and gain little bits here and there and there and there. However, the reality today is we're seeing a lot more sophisticated, financially motivated groups who, rather than trying to get little bits from a lot of people, they're willing to employ highly targeted activity to gain larger amounts from fewer people. And that takes a different type of exploit than they were previously using. Also, since the exploit kit market never really rebounded after the developers of Black Hole and Angler were removed, we saw the introduction of other things like exploit document builders and one-day exploits that are leveraging things that weren't necessarily 0 days, but due to the price and the availabilities, actors saw this as good enough. And macros. This is a big one. Macros allow actors to perform a lot of activity. And since developers and vendors don't see macros as inherently malicious, it's abuse of legitimate functionality, they're very slow to do anything about activity leveraging these. Oops, wrong button. So last thing I do before I hand over to Kat is just quickly show you some interesting things. I'm not sure if you guys ever were curious about what's being targeted in terms of 0 days, but the reality is this isn't anything that's obscure or rare. These are hopefully what you'd expect. Over 75% of the targeting affects either Microsoft or Adobe products. That's because actors want the most bang for their buck. If you're going to spend a lot of time working and developing these 0 days, you want them to affect the most or the highest possible number of things, even if you don't plan on using it widespread. And likewise, the products follow suit. No surprises. Windows, Flash, Internet Explorer, and Office are the largest targeted there as well. At this time, now that kind of gives you an idea of where we've been in terms of exploitation, I'm going to hand it over to Kat to kind of talk about where we are today.
Okay, thank you so much, Jared. So in this section, I'm going to be covering kind of the big trends that popped out to us as we were doing this project in order to get you in our headspace and propose a few hypotheses before Parnian goes ahead and drops some fantastic data on you in the coming minutes. So the first thing that popped out to us is a big shift in the number and type of groups that we are seeing leveraging 0 days over the past couple of years. In the beginning, in the earlier part of the decade, you were really seeing what I would think of as the usual suspects. So Chinese groups, Russian groups, really being the ones who were using 0 days quite a bit. However, in the past couple of years, we actually have seen that decline substantially. Instead, what we're seeing is a lot of groups that haven't previously displayed that they have access to 0 days, suddenly using them in operations quite frequently, actually. Some examples of this, within the past year, Fin6 used 0 day in their operations. Another example that Parnian will go into in more depth is Sandcat, a group that was recently linked by Kaspersky to Uzbekistan. We don't have as much insight into this specific group. However, the number and rate at which they are using 0 days should definitely be something that grabs your attention. At the same time, a lot of the groups that are suddenly showing that they are able to use 0 days, many of them have or have suspected ties to private security companies. In many cases, that is where it has been assessed that perhaps they got access to the 0 day to begin with. In a few cases as well, multiple groups use the same 0 day within quick succession of one another, indicating that either there is an overlap in the groups themselves or in their supplier. At the same time that we're seeing these trends, there's also the background trend of prices for 0 days going up. Different kinds of entities, from bug bounty programs to these private security companies, are offering high prices for this type of information. In some cases, this information is then able to be passed on to vendors so that they can issue a patch before disclosure. And in other cases, it's used to create tools that are then being sold, often to foreign governments, in order to bolster their operations with these types of capabilities. So what should we take away from this to begin with? Well, the types of groups that I'm talking about, the ones who have suspected ties to private security companies, they are not necessarily the types of groups that you would expect. They are not China, they are Russia. And in fact, as I mentioned before, they're using 0 days quite often in a very short period of time. This potentially has implications for how we understand their sophistication. And it's important that we're looking at all these different factors when we are assessing these types of groups. So not only are they displaying that they have access to 0 days, but what are their other TTPs? Another thing to take into account is that there are competing hypotheses for why we may be seeing this disparity. On the one hand, it may be that these groups are in fact using more 0 days than, for example, Russia or China. On the other hand, it may be that they are simply using them more openly or in another way that is getting them caught more readily. It may also be that Russian and Chinese actors are also using just as many, but they are doing it in a way where they are not getting caught, and that in fact in the coming years there may be evidence that impacts this trend line. So it's important to keep all of those things in mind as we go forward. However, as we look at 0 days as a measure of sophistication, another hypothesis that we want to put forward is looking at a group's ability to turn around a known vulnerability and use that and basically weaponize it in order to use it in their operations. And using this as a potentially, I won't say better, but as a good metric for the capabilities of that group. Parnian will go into a specific example of where we've actually seen state actors do this within a very quick turnaround. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about some of the behind-the-scenes things that are potentially impacting access to 0 days, both that are quite self-evident, and then also that we project will be increasingly evident in the future. Obviously, talent that is able to identify a 0 day is going to have a competing interest. You want the bragging rights, you want to be recognized for your work, and at the same time, there is a potential financial reward. There's also something we want to put forward, which is this idea of the nationalization of 0 days, which is that, especially as 0 days are increasingly commodified, that states really have an interest in keeping knowledge of those types of vulnerabilities in-house. For example, when I think it was in 2018, there was open source reporting that China was actively discouraging researchers from going and participating in conferences where rewards were being offered for previously unknown vulnerabilities. And we assess that as we move forward and as, especially as more states want to have more offensive capabilities, that we're going to see a greater crackdown on talent being able to sell or disclose 0 days as they see fit. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Parnian.
Thanks, Kat. So In this section, we look at the tempo and methods that, or the manner that track groups use zero-day vulnerabilities. The majority of the zero days that are used are targeted attacks, as Jared has mentioned, because these zero-day vulnerabilities, if they are used frequently, there's higher chance that they get discovered and eventually patched. So these 0 days, there are lots of effort that went into making them, and they cost a lot. And if they're caught, all this effort and monetary value is gone. So we looked at the 0 day vulnerabilities from 2012 to 2019. Keep in mind the dates that we mention here is just when the CV was announced, not when they were actually used. Because sometimes there's a lag between the time that the 0 day is used because of the nature of them and the time that the 0 day is actually being found by researcher or vendors and the CV is announced. So if you look at this graph, the size of the circles and the colors show how many 0 days have been used by each group. For instance, APT 28 is one of the more sophisticated groups, and the 0 days used by them are single-handedly among one of the larger groups that they are the groups that use the largest amount of 0 days per group. And then we see some other unknown groups, new groups that are less sophisticated, like Fruity Armor, Stealth Falcon, and Black Oasis, and Sandcat, that use plenty of 0 days per group. So we get to the details of how they have been used over the years for each country. So we see from 2012 to 2016, the majority of 0 days that have been announced were used by Chinese group or Russian actors. And then from 2016 onwards, we see new actors from Uzbekistan or UAE that have been using 0 day vulnerability or exploits. Once some of these new actors are less sophisticated, as Kat mentioned, and we suspect that they have bought the 0 days from private companies. And because there are some overlaps between them, we suspect that they use the same company. Something to notice is that other than these less sophisticated actors, we have some mature actors, like Chinese actors, that have used the 0 day vulnerabilities that were used against them in attack, and then reverse engineered them, reconstruct them, and build the successful attack for themselves. We'll talk about the details of these less sophisticated groups and new groups that we've seen later on. So in the era of 2012 to 2015, we see that APT 28 has used the majority of the 0 days, followed by APT 17. In this era, as we mentioned, the majority of the groups are from Russia and China. And then from 2016 onwards, we see the groups like Stealth Falcon, Fruity Armor, Black Oasis have used the majority of the 0 days, but we see that we still see some Russian groups active in this era, but we don't see that many Chinese groups being active in this era. We also see some financial groups like Fin6 and Fin8 working in this era as well. So the notable APT groups that we mentioned, the Fruity Armor, the Stealth Falcon, and Sandcats, and Black Oasis, who are they? So Fruity Armor is an espionage group that is located in, we're suspecting that they're located in UAE, and they have targeted, they were first reported by Kaspersky. They have targeted organization in Middle East, as well as Sweden and Thailand. And then we have Stealth Falcon, which is reported by Citizen Lab, and they have targeted human rights activists. This is an interesting example because they have used a malware along with 3 0 days to target these activists. So they have shown that they are really, they are resourceful and they're not afraid to spend millions of dollars on just one single dissident. We suspect that they have bought their 0 days from NSO groups. And then moving on, we go to the Sandcat, which is an Uzbek intelligence source, that's Uzbek state intelligence actors. And we have seen that they have targeted Middle East. And Kaspersky has recently found their operation. It was an interesting story because Sandcat have used several 0 days that we suspect were shared among different threat groups. And then they didn't have good operation security, so they burned the 0 days, which also burned the 0 days for other nation-state actors. And then the last is Black Oasis, which has also, we are suspected that they're the customer of Gamma Group. And they have used Finfisher spyware, and their targets are mostly in Middle East. So as Jared mentioned, we've seen that most of the 0 days that we've seen are used in targeted attacks. But if you're an executive, you should not just worry about the 0 days. The majority of attacks that we're seeing are used by old, unpatched vulnerability. And then most of the mature threat groups have used these unpatched vulnerabilities, and they quickly provide exploit for them to do their operation. Here's an example of APT37. In May 2017, they have used 0-day CV 2017-0199 to send, this was the vulnerability that they have used. They send a spear phishing email to a board member of a Middle Eastern company, and to just go back, APT37 is a North Korean actor. They have sent the phishing email to a Middle Eastern board member because they have some dealing with North Korea, and it didn't go through well. So what happened is that they conduct an attack, and they send the email to this board member, included a document there that contained the exploit that used this vulnerability. After the vulnerability was exploited, they were able to download the malware that was installed, and that malware helped them to get access to that board member's computer information, and also they were able to capture screenshots and download and install further payloads. So it's hotly debated that whether we should publish POCs, proof of concepts, or exploit code. And people are saying that if you do that, you're helping the threat actors. But based on the research that we have done on all the 0 days that we've seen, we cannot say that exactly that's true, right? So what we're seeing is that if the POC or exploit code is being published, you have less time to apply the patch, but it doesn't change the way that threat actors are using the 0 days. As Jared explained, most affected vendors by track groups are, you can see here, the majority of them are Microsoft and Adobe, which makes sense because Microsoft has 78% of the global market, and then Apple has 14%. So it makes sense to see these percentages. And then about the products, again, no surprises here. Although when we look at here and we see all the big products, it makes sense that the threat actors will go after the products that are used by majority of the people. But then when they actually want to use the attack, they may have it more targeted. So the 0-day may work for the majority of the people, but the attack may be more targeted, as Jared mentioned. And this is not the only products that they get targeted. For instance, a few years ago, suspected North Korean actors have found a 0-day in Hangul word processing. That was a word processor used by the majority of the South Korean organizations and governments. And then it shows that it doesn't matter what product it's not just the main products that you have. It shows that threat actors will try to find what you're using if they want to target you, and then they go after and find vulnerabilities and 0-days in there. So what are the main takeaways? Knowing who is targeting you and why matters. Because if you know the threat actors that are targeting you or targeting your industry, you can know how you can stop them. We said that, because 0-days are unknown to the public, it is hard to defend against them. But if you have a proactive and defense in depth approach, you can mitigate them in other parts of the attack lifecycle. So if you look at the example of, you get an email which has a document with exploit in it, and the document, when opened, it downloads some malware. So there are lots of steps before they can use the 0-day that can be stopped, right? So if you have a good email or network security in place, they can stop those 0-days before even they are used. So hand it to Kat.
Next on our implications, as these two have already covered, even though we are seeing more 0-days, again, they are being more targeted. That doesn't mean that it hurts any less when it works. So while focusing on that likelihood is a good idea, as more and more groups are having access to 0-days, focusing on what kind of groups are interested in you, are interested in your industry, are interested in your region, and drawing on that intelligence to inform how you are making decisions is really more important than ever. And then lastly, foot stomping a bit on that sophistication point. I know that our title was 0-days used by APT groups, but TTPs used by APT groups in general is really paramount, especially as 0-days are increasingly used by a wider number of different types of actors.
And my big takeaways as a Vuln guy is going to focus a lot around patches and stuff like that. And if you're here from a Vuln management perspective or on that tactical level, this advice isn't necessarily designed for you since it's an executive track. And if you're an executive or a high-level management, hopefully you already know this. But obviously we can't predict 0-days, but we can make sure we're prepared to deal with them when they do arise. The importance of identifying why vendors and products like Microsoft and Adobe are the ones that are most targeted is that if you're an organization worried about 0-days, you can ask the question of, is there more we could be doing to get the patches for Adobe and Microsoft out as fast as possible? My second point here is, if notable breaches have taught us anything, that exploitation impacts everyone. It's not just the job of the team in charge of figuring out patch management within your organization. When there's large breaches, this goes all the way up to the top. This goes all the way to the CEO. It's no longer a problem just for that patch team. It is a problem for everyone. And to be 100% honest with you, I have been lucky over the years to be involved in hundreds of different sales opportunities. And the one thing I can say from experience is when we're trying to sell threat intelligence or technical intelligence or strategic intelligence, those high-level executives are very engaged in the discussion. They're asking questions. They want to know more. But whenever I'm brought in and talk about Vuln, oftentimes they check out because they're like, we're going to bring in our patch guys. We're going to talk their language. And I understand it. from a tactical level, that's where a lot of people think about vulnerabilities. What's the next thing I need to patch? But if you're not zooming out to get the larger picture, see the forest through the trees, you may miss some larger trends that would allow you and your organization to shift the way you're doing things overall. And finally, this is something I tell everybody when I go in there and they ask, with the ever-increasing number of vulnerabilities, where do I start? I know every single organization has limited resourcing. That's not unique to anybody. I see it myself, just year over year, the sheer volume of vulnerabilities that are being released more and more each year. And when I first got into the vulnerability space, my discussions with customers used to be, Jared, where do I start first? What do I patch first before everything else? But the reality is, fast forward today, the discussion now is, Jared, tell me what I can get away without patching, which isn't an ideal solution, but it's just the reality of where we are in this space today. So when I get that question, I always say, let's start with the active threats. Who's targeting you? Do you know who's targeting you? What vulnerabilities they're exploiting? Start there. Start with the you. Then I tell them to move on to the like you. So it may not necessarily be your organization directly, but look at people in your industry. Look at people in your region, a combination of the two. That's a good place to go after you have the ones targeting you. Then after that, let's take care of everything else that we know to be exploited in the wild. It may not be targeting anything like you, but if it's out there, it could be easily shifted your way in the future. Once you're done with the active threats, let's start looking at the potential threats. So this is where I like to point to things like exploit code availability. There's organizations out there that solely preach that you need to focus on the exploit code availability. But if you do that alone, there's plenty of exploit code or vulnerabilities with exploit code that are never exploited in the wild. And additionally, there's plenty of things that are exploited in the wild that never had code available. So that's the only way you're approaching this. You're going to miss holes and leave yourself exposed. And additionally, look at what people are talking about. What are the underground actors saying? What's the next things that they want to target long before the code's ever developed? Once you're done with those two, then you can go on to everything else, what I call the no known. There's no known reason for this to be a threat at this time. That doesn't mean you can't get burned by one of those, but the other things are giving you plenty of indication as to why they pose a more significant threat to you at that moment. And the last two things, I could rant on these two things, but I won't. I say ignore CVS. Ignoring is probably drastic. And I'll tell you a quick story. It's in public record, so it's okay. A couple years ago, I was brought to talk to Congress, and I was asked by them why companies were being breached by the Apache Struts vulnerability when CVSS had scored this as a critical vulnerability. How could you miss it? And I asked them the simple question of, do you know how many vulnerabilities that NVD had scored a critical in 2017? And the answer was 1,600. As a vulnerability expert in my team, when we're rating things, we look at critical vulnerabilities as things that you as an organization need to drop everything you're doing at that moment and get it taken care of. You can't do that with 1,600 vulnerabilities a year. So while CVSS has its place and has a purpose, it's not the best metric to be solely relying on. And branded vulnerabilities, once again, something I can rant on forever. But the reality is we're seeing an increasing number of organizations spinning up so many cycles, wasting so many hours, trying to find out the next thing that has a logo and a name, and what to do with it. And the reality is, yeah, some of the early ones mattered. Heartbleed, Shell Shock, those had names and logos. Those were actually big threats. But since, very few of them ever get exploited in the wild. And while those are getting a lot of attention, things like CVE 2017-11882 continues to be one of the most widely exploited vulnerabilities that we see by threat actors. You don't see a single article about it. So they're not helping you. Focus on the threats, and that'll help you secure your organization in a much more efficient manner. So with that, that's the end of our presentation. So I'd like to open it up. There is the microphone in case anyone has any questions. And if there are no questions, we'll stick around here for a little bit longer to talk to you guys if anyone wants. Yes.
I missed a few minutes of his talk, but 0 day is in the name, so there are no patches, right? What in your methodology of identification of threat actors that may be targeting you is really solely related to 0 days, things you could mitigate for to prevent those things from affecting you as much. Things, and there's no denigration of vulnerabilities monitoring and patching, but just the very nature of it is that you don't have a patch. What other things should we be doing to kind of mitigate for these
Yeah,
threat actors?
absolutely. It kind of goes back to what Parnian was saying and the importance of why understanding who's exploiting these vulnerabilities is important. Um, in a lot of cases, we understand how these actors operate. So we know what they're going to do before we ever get to the exploit. We know what they're going to do after. The sad reality is, I mean, everyone here is smart enough to know we're never going to stop 100% of the 0 days. So even if you can't stop it at the initial email, if it's an email spear phishing lure, if you can't stop it there and the exploit goes off, you need to make sure you can detect it elsewhere, whether it is identifying the activity on the network, trying to move laterally. Um, yeah, I get it. To sit here and put a slide that says patch kind of sounds funny. That's just to help limit the time that you're exposed. But that's like she was saying, the defense in depth approach is very important because even if you can't stop the 0 day, in which many cases you can't, you can catch it elsewhere to potentially protect yourself. So hopefully that answered. Any other questions?
Good afternoon. Thank you for the presentation. So we all know the threat actors, to the extent possible, are trying to maximize their return on investment, right? So they don't want to burn their good stuff if they don't have to. So you mentioned the dip in number of exploits or 0 days that were observed, and then now that we're in 2019, we're at a great rise in this. It would be wishful thinking to think that, well, maybe they have to resort to more 0 days because we're doing something better with our security posture that they can't exploit as many of the low-hanging fruit as they may have in the past. Can we make any sort of conclusion like that, or is that just wishful thinking?
Well, I mean, I think that's a fair statement. Pointing to the fact that we have seen a shift or a shift in the groups that are targeting targeting 0 days. It's not Russia and China anymore. They have understood that with their capabilities, they can usually get away with targeting things that are known or low-hanging fruit. It's these other newer players or these new people coming into the market who, for whatever reason, I'm not the expert, so you guys can jump in if you have, but they might see the 0 day as the only tool that they have, and they have the money, they have the resourcing, so to be effective, they can jump right to that. I don't know if you guys would say anything different.
Yeah, so we've seen the less sophisticated actors because they cannot conduct an attack without the use of 0 days. They're not as sophisticated as Chinese and Russian groups. So they can buy 0 days, right? So they can ask a private company for a specific 0 day, and they don't care if they get burned because they have the resources, they have the financial resources to support them. And it's a good start for them. So because we see these threat actors are showing up these years, the number of 0 days that we've seen have grown as well. Kat, do you have something?
Yeah, sure. Just to go back to one of the hypotheses we were proposing, it does seem like when you have groups that are burning, quite a lot of 0 days in quick succession, that is saying something about their budget. And that is saying something about the countries who are investing in these capabilities, how much money they want to put towards that. That is not to say, again, that states like Russia and China aren't willing to spend that much money, but that is what's visible to us.
Thank you.
My question is, where do you see this all going? With 10 years from now, is Microsoft going to be putting out more and more products that have more and more 0 days, and Adobe, and not to pick on any one company, but is there a means to kind of depress the number of 0 days and have more secure software coming out. Do you see that happening in the next 5 to 10 years?
Not to sound depressing, I don't. Just because I feel that vulnerabilities are an inherent part of software development. Even the most patient and slow developers who try their best introduce bugs into the program, introduce vulnerabilities. And sometimes that's just because the way we had done something as a standard for so long, you find out was wrong for a different reason, and new vectors or new methods come out. And if we're just being honest with ourselves, the vendors, Microsoft's never going to slow down what they do, limit the number of products. They're going to keep trying to do everything they can to gain that market share. And that's nothing against them. Like I said, even if it wasn't them, there'd be somebody else. It's just an inherent part of the reality of software and the code that is used to develop that. So it's a depressing answer, but I don't really see that changing in the next 5, 10 plus years.
Yeah. On the other hand, there are things that individuals or companies can do to even get ahead of that. When Jared was talking about vectors, for example, quite a lot of the exploits that we're seeing, both 0 days and non-0 days, are delivered via that phishing email. So even just having a better training program to teach people what a phishing email looks like. I know that we put out a great product talking about what are some great lures, for example, that you can expect to see coming down the pipeline in the next weeks or months that you can be on the lookout for and avoid. And it seems very simple, but if you can get around that vector, you can decrease your attack surface in that way, in that very simple way.
Yeah, and I think that the software developers have changed their testing over the years. So previously, we didn't have that many automated testing for the products that are going out. Now we have fuzzers that can help the software developers. We have secure software development. It's like the life cycle that they go through. And now that they have even the word secure in it, it means that something is added, right? So all the iterations that they go through, all the testing that they go through, I think it has changed over the years, and it got better. And there's a chance that it gets even better in the future. We cannot say, as Jared said, that it's going to disappear because, we're all human, we're prone to error. But there are approaches that are being taken to make sure that we see less and less vulnerabilities.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So with that, it looks like we are done with questions, but we'll be over here on the side in case anybody wants to come up to us afterwards. And just real quick, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it, and enjoy the last sessions today. We'll close out strong. Thank you.
Thank you.